As we resume in Chapter 29, we will pick up with Section 29.4, moving through 29.6, with just a little bit of introduction from 29.7 on the primates. So before us, we have a slide showing the last three major groups or classes: the reptilia, the reptiles, the aves, the birds, and mammalia, the mammals. All three of these classes utilize a amniotic system of membranes surrounding the embryo. Hence, they're called amniotes. So if we take a look here at this bird egg, you see that the embryo is encased first in a membrane called the amnion, which helps directly cushion and protect the embryo. It's a fluid-filled sac. Then we see that there is another membrane called the chorion, through which there is an exchange of gases. This is for a bird egg or a reptilian egg. And then lastly, we have the allantois, which holds nitrogen waste products. Additionally, there is a yolk, which provides food source for the growing embryo, which in birds and reptiles is encased in a hard shell to help protect it, as there is external development in the reptiles and the birds. This is not the case for the mammals, as they will have internal development. So moving on to the reptiles, class Reptilia. These are tetrapods, as they all are in these last three groups. And you may say, well, snakes fall into the reptile group, but they have secondarily lost their legs. So the earliest quote-unquote snakes did have legs, but then have lost them through evolution. All reptiles have a scaly skin because these animals are completely allowed to live on land without having to be close to water, although some of them just choose to be close to water. Their skin is reinforced with a compound called keratin, and that helps to waterproof their skin. And by waterproofing, it helps to keep water inside the body, so the body does not lose water through the skin. But it also makes it so that these animals are not able to breathe through their skin as the amphibians are. Everyone in this group is an ectotherm, meaning that the body heat from the animal is dependent on the environment. And this is true for our amphibians and our fish as well. So this is why fish can survive in a pond in the winter, even though ice is formed, because they can lower their metabolism and they do not lose important metabolism that is required to keep them alive, even though the temperature drops considerably. All members of class Reptilia have lungs. There are no gills in this grouping. And they have three-chambered hearts, similar to the amphibians, with the exception of crocodiles, which actually have a four-chambered heart. Internal fertilization, so they do mate. This is a step up from the previous groups in evolution, and that they are not releasing their eggs and sperm to the environment, but rather a mating occurs where there's a transfer of sperm to the female. Their fertilization takes place, but then the egg is released and development happens in the external environment. Some examples of class Reptilia are the dinosaurs, which are now extinct, but we have extant species of the lizards, the snakes, turtles, crocs, and alligators. So if we do look at that extinct branch of the reptilian tree, we see that dinosaurs were dominant, the dominant vertebrate, up until about 65 million years ago, when we had our last major mass extinction, and the dinosaurs were particularly vulnerable to that event of an asteroid hitting the Earth, changing the climate, and impacting the ecosystem. Now, dinosaurs, we believe, might have been endothermic, meaning that they are highly impacted by climatic changes. They have to maintain a certain body temperature so that when this major event happened 65 million years ago and there was a huge climate shift, they may not have been able to adjust or adapt. There is evidence in the fossil record that there was parental care involved with the dinosaurs. We tend to think of them as being very harsh and difficult creatures, but there is evidence that they took care of their young. And dinosaurs are not considered to be more closely related to modern day birds and crocs. They not so much to other they are considered to be more closely related to current day birds and crocs, not so much to other modern day reptiles. So here we have an example of the crocs and the alligators. So they live in or near marine or fresh water. So here's an example of an animal that breathes air, lives on land, but through its lifestyle prefers to be in a water environment. Sorry, I forgot to remove this slide, so just disregard. Another group of reptiles are the lizards and the snakes. So this is our largest group of reptiles. And they're found everywhere on the planet except for Antarctica. They are a very diverse group of organisms, lots and lots of different species of both lizards and snakes. And as I mentioned before, they are both considered tetrapods. Even though snakes do not exhibit the presence of limbs, they still have remnants of hips and shoulders where the limbs would have attached, and that allows us to see that somewhere back in their ancestral history, there were snakes that did have limbs. Another group of reptiles are the turtles and the tortoises. Here they do have a tough outer shell, both dorsally, so on the back, and ventrally on the belly. Some people think that they may not have an internal skeleton, but in fact they do. Their shell is built into their skeleton, and this dorsal shell actually grows from the ribs and the spinal column, those particular bones. This shell, upper shell, is called the carapace. As we move on to our next class of mammals, this is class Aves, or the birds. Now here we move on to a group of birds, a group of species that are endothermic. Everybody before this has been ectothermic or exothermic, meaning that they will adjust their body temperature to the ambient, the outside temperature. But for the birds, they are endothermic. They need to maintain their body temperature regardless of what the environmental temperature is. Therefore, they have a very high metabolic rate. As well, most birds do have the ability of flight, and this is an activity that takes a lot of energy, therefore is metabolically very expensive. The birds are also the first group of species that all have a 4-chambered heart. So every member of class Aves has 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles, which produces a very efficient heart. We'll see that in the next slide. All birds have internal fertilization, but external development. So similar to the reptiles, there is a mating in which sperm is transferred from the male to the female. Fertilization occurs internally in the female, but then eggs are laid and there's external development of the young. Now, because of this ability for most birds to fly, they have special modifications to their body plan. They have feathers, which are modified scales. So feathers are modified scales, which allow them to utilize the wind and also aids in insulation. They also have hollow bones to help reduce their weight in order to give them more loft. They have a sternum or a breastbone that's in the shape of a keel, like the front of a boat. We call it the wishbone, anecdotally, but this allows them to glide through the air. And they have very efficient respiration, meaning they are able to easily extract oxygen from the air and utilize that in order to be able to power their muscles. So what I'd like to do now is just go back and look at the three types of hearts that we've talked about. So we had the three-chambered in the amphibians, the three-chambered in the reptiles, most of the reptiles, remembering that the crocs do have a four-chambered. And then for our birds and mammals, we have a fully separated four chambers. So remember, with the amphibians, we had three chambers, two atria. And anything that's blue means it's deoxygenated, lacking oxygen. Red means fully charged up with oxygen, and purple is something in the middle. And anytime you have purple, that means the heart is not working quite as efficiently as it could be. So for the amphibian, we see that deoxygenated and oxygenated blood returning from the lungs is going to mix in the one ventricle, and we're going to send that out to the amphibian's body, and therefore it's not as completely charged with oxygen as it potentially could be. Remember, amphibians have other mechanisms for obtaining oxygen that they need, so it's not as big of a problem. Reptiles only have use of the lungs, so we see here that they have a three-chambered heart, but there is this septum or division spot in the third chamber, so that what happens is that blood from the body as well as blood from the lungs that's been charged up with oxygen comes into this one ventricle, and we do get a little bit of mixing, but we're going to send blood off back to the lungs to get recharged and blood out to the body. But what goes out to the body is also a mix of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And then we move on to the four-chambered, which is the most efficient because we have completely separated. You notice there's this wall here between anything blue and anything red. And this goes for us as well as any other mammal or bird. This is the most efficient heart structure. So blood returning from the body that has utilized its oxygen comes back into the right side of the heart, goes through the atrium into the ventricle, out to the lungs in order to pick up more oxygen. Then from the lungs comes back into the left side of the heart, into the atrium, through to this ventricle, two ventricles now, and this ventricle only sends blood out to the body. So the only blood that is pumped out to the body is completely oxygenated. Now, as you've probably heard, it's believed that the evolution of birds is closely related to ancestors that were dinosaurs, more modern day reptiles. So we're still not completely clear, but the discovery of Archaeopteryx was an important fossil. So this is it that was found that appears to be a transition species between the birds and the dinosaurs. You can clearly see what look like feather structures and also some reptilian structures as well. And so this is believed to be one of those transition structures, transition species that led to the evolution of modern day birds. Our very last class that we'll take a look at, these are the mammals, class Mammalia. So all mammals are endothermic. Endothermic meaning they need to maintain body temperature regardless of the outside temperature. And so that takes a lot of energy. Some other characteristics of mammals are that they all have hair or fur. And so we see here in this cat who has quite a nice furry coat. We also have some species that are still mammals but have very, very little, if no hair, and they are still fall into the mammal category. All mammals have mammary glands. So mammary glands are a structure which is a modified sweat gland that instead of producing sweat produces milk, which is used to feed young offspring. We also see in mammals that they have evolved true teeth, and they have different types of teeth that indicate their diet. So here we see a carnivore, a lion with strong, sharp canines for tearing and shredding food. We see flat molars in this horse for grinding grains. And then we see a mix of modified canines as well as molars, which make humans omnivores, something in between a carnivore and an herbivore. Additionally, mammals have 3 tiny little bones in their inner ear, which transmit sound waves into something that can be recognized by our nervous system, a signal. And that is characteristic of all members of class Mammalia. Also, mammals have a cerebral cortex. Now, it varies depending on the animal, but the cerebral cortex is the outer part of the brain, which is very developed in humans, but may not be as developed in other mammals. But this is the thinking part of the brain, and it is present in all mammals. Additionally, all mammals have internal fertilization, where sperm is transferred from the male of the species to the female. Fertilization takes place inside the female's body. But then, and only in the mammals, do we see internal development, so that the offspring go through their embryonic stages all the way up to being able to exist on their own at birth, and so an internal development. Now, within the mammals, there are what we call 3 clades or groups. And so these are variations on the mammalian lifestyle. The very first group we're going to look at are called the monotremes, and the platypus and the echidnas, that's an echidna, both found in Australia. So this is a very limited number of animals, and they are not the most evolutionarily sound of the mammals, so therefore there's very few of them, and we find them only in Australia because they've been a little bit secluded. These mammals lay eggs, so they have internal fertilization, but they lay eggs which are very similar to turtle eggs, and so they have internal fertilization but completely external development, and they have no teeth. But they do have mammary glands and fur, so they get to be in this class Mammalia. The next clade within Mammalia are the marsupials. So we have the monotremes and the marsupials. The marsupials, the embryo, they have internal fertilization and the beginnings of development, but the embryo was born very early, at like 8 weeks, and crawls out of the female and into an external pouch where it will attach to a mammary gland and finish its development. And so these species, these marsupials, are found primarily again in Australia because these are not the most robust form of mammals, and therefore, because they've been secluded, they haven't had evolutionary pressures to which affect their survival. There is one species of marsupial in North America, and that's the possum. And lastly, we have our largest group of mammals. These are the placental mammals, And the placental mammals are characteristic by, of course, having a placenta. So what is a placenta? Well, it is an organ which is present only during pregnancy. It's made of fetal tissue, and it regulates gas exchange and nutrient delivery from the mother to the growing fetus. So the fetus is going to remain internal and develop internally until it is able to live on its own in the outside world. So there's internal embryonic development complete before birth when you are in the placental, or it's sometimes called the eutherian group, but I prefer to use the term placental. So the majority of mammals that we think of, dogs, cats, cows, rabbits, humans, are all placental mammals. Now let's take a look in class Mammalia of a particular order, the order of the primates, and we'll just briefly introduce the primates. So the anthropoids is another name for the primates. We see that they fall into two groups, the Old World monkeys and the New World monkeys, depending on their location. Old World, Africa and Asia, New World, South America. And we see that we can also call these New World monkeys the apes. They have no tails. They spend most of their time on the ground. They tend to be more intelligent than their New World members. And they include the chimps, which are the closest relatives to the humans, the gorillas, the orangutans, and of course, the humans fall into this group. So no tails, a nose structure with downward facing nostrils, and spending most of their time on the ground and more intelligent. These are the Old World monkeys, the apes. The New World monkeys, here we have an example of the howler monkey. Also we have the spider monkey is another example of a New World monkey. They do have tails. They're arboreal, meaning they spend most of their times in trees, and they're generally smaller than their Old World cousins. And when we look at the primates that originate and then eventually lead to humans, we see that within the order of primates, we have the family Hominidae, the hominoids, and those include the chimps, the gorilla, and the humans. And a final look at the evolution of the Hominidae into the hominini, and then finally into the humans. We see that Homo sapiens have really only been on the scene for about 200,000 years, which is a very short amount of time in the scale of the evolution on the Earth. And that will finish our material for Chapter 29.